Okay, hi everyone. I get the easy job of just introducing the moderator. These guys will do all the hard work today. My name is Howard Chang. I head corporate development for HCL. In my role, I look at M&A and acquisitions and investments. We've invested over $4 billion in the last 3 years, and with a heavy, predominantly portion of that in technology, in IP, and capabilities. One of the more interesting things in my role is just getting to see how companies address the technology market and invest to stay ahead of the game, ahead of their competitors. Very interesting part of the role. Since I think the GDP, R&D was actually not part of the GDP calculation until 2013. It was considered intermediary input. Since 2013, that's been tracked. It's now about 3% of GDP, of U.S. GDP, 500 billion. And Amazon leads the way with around 23 billion of spend alone, 2017. I'd be remiss without mentioning Alphabet. Google is right behind them, since they're on the panel. But the top 5 represent 70 billion of R&D spend. Globally, it's 1.7 trillion. So we thought that with that backdrop, it'd be a very interesting and topical theme today, and for us at the conference to look at technology, how the innovation has changed, how it might evolve. And it's my honor to really introduce, and I'm excited to introduce our moderator, who I met yesterday. I wish I had met him two weeks earlier. I just finished an integration project. Could have used his help, but never too late, never too late. Our moderator here is Saikat Chaudhry. He is currently the executive director of the Mac Institute for Innovation Management and also a professor at the Wharton School. His work focuses a lot on looking at the operational performance metrics of innovative or innovation-driven acquisitions. What are the challenges? What are the effective management styles to get the most out of it? How do you manage sort of the R&D, organic, inorganic, outsourcing as the world evolves in different ways of delivery? So please welcome me in joining Saikat, and I will turn it over to him.
Thank you, Howard. Thank you. It's such a distinct pleasure to be here because it's an august audience, but more importantly, the panelists that we have today are just phenomenal. So I'm just very, very excited. Murray Road is the CEO of TIBCO. Then we've got Sanjay Poonan here, who is the COO of VMware. Rajan Sheth, who heads the AI activities for Google Cloud. Sanjay Varma, who's an entrepreneur, founder. He happens to be employee number 3 at Alibaba with Jack Ma back then. And of course, Kalyan Kumar, also known as KK, who is the CTO of HCL. So first, warm welcome for all of you. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
This topic is so exciting. It's not only near and dear to my heart, but thinking about the future of product innovation, oftentimes we get caught up in the technology. And the technology is an important part, but in addition, we have to think about the strategic and organizational aspects which help these technologies realize their potential. I think that's where some of the art and the science is and some of the things that we will explore in this panel discussion today. The format that we'll have is I've asked each of them to prepare 2 minutes, just 2 minutes to emphasize of remarks on the future of product innovation from their vantage point, and they all have different stories, so it'll be complementary perspectives. Then I will launch into a moderated panel discussion for some time. We'll get some of your questions involved, and then subsequently we'll close with some concluding remarks. So that's the panel. And of course, I encourage everyone always to be very, very lively, interactive, but of course, don't always agree with each other. Make sure that we disagree, get out the points. That makes for a fun and exciting and engaging panel discussion. So let's start with Murray. What are your thoughts? Future of product innovation. From your vantage point, what do you think is going to happen and is happening?
Well, I think for us, it's been an interesting journey because we're a roughly just a little over 20-year-old company that started with what at the time was a very innovative idea in the world of integration and messaging, particularly for distributed systems. And over time, we've seen the market shift out of the data center into the cloud, so it's changed the focus on innovation and how we think about it. We've gone through a period, last 3 or 4 years, where we've basically moved all our core IP into the cloud, so it's available to customers on both still a deployed software basis, but now as a set of cloud services. And it does introduce some changes in the way we think about innovation, how we organize around innovation. I think the other big part of the business for us is the data science space. So we provide a lot of both services and capabilities to help customers manage their data better and get more out of that data. And increasingly, that's turning into not just data, but algorithms. And that's a whole new kind of space for innovation. It's putting new demands on the kind of people you hire, how you train them, how you cultivate innovation inside the company. So it's a pretty interesting landscape, and it continues to be a challenging one.
Lots of good fodder that I need to probe into. But Sanjay, your thoughts?
Yeah, I'd just say a couple of things that have kind of been probably, I'd say North Stars to the way in which we've thought about innovation at VMware, and I think I'd fall through some of my experience at SAP too. I think, Saika, similar to your own research, innovation for us could be inorganic or organic. And sometimes we have to pursue an inorganic path when we have to jolt the system to bring in sort of a new DNA. And we did that 5 years ago. In fact, I think it's exactly today, a 5-year anniversary of our acquiring a company called AirWatch that really propelled VMware into the mobility space. So most of you think of VMware and you think the data center. But we also today manage and secure most of the devices in the world. And that happened because we did this inorganic move 5 years ago today. And that put in the DNA of a company a very different mindset about devices that complemented our main body of thinking around data center. But equally as important is organic innovation. In fact, I would argue organic innovation is much more important than inorganic, because if you don't have an organic DNA to what you're doing, the inorganic will just become ultimately a graveyard of acquisitions that fail. And in the cloud world, we didn't have it right initially. We tried to build our own public cloud 5 years ago. We had to come to our own catharsis of that effort, divested that effort, and then decided to build a partnership model with the public cloud vendors in a hybrid cloud vision. And that's worked out really well with us. We've started with Amazon, and our intent is to cover the other clouds. And I think the third thing I would say that we've really taken seriously is we partner a lot with the Stanford Design School, because we really had to bring to our product managers design.
It'll be Wharton soon, but anyway, yeah.
I'm sorry. It's not the Stanford Business School, don't worry about it. But the design school, but it was just location close by and so on. We felt that if our product managers could really understand design thinking, and we're big believers in design thinking. I'm not making a plug for Stanford, but that notion of design thinking was very important to the way in which we transformed our product managers to think in the mind of a consumer or a customer.
Rajan, your thoughts?
So I'm seeing a few overlapping trends. And one thing that's been interesting, so I've been at Google about 14 years working on enterprise technologies.
Before that, right?
I was at VMware before that, yes. Which is a
All
wonderful,
good talent starts.
wonderful company.
Get that out there.
Get that plug in there.
Can I disagree with that?
All right.
But what was interesting is I've worked in our enterprise group for that entire time and seen kind of three big overlapping trends that we've hit. One was cloud. And kind of not only cloud as a delivery mechanism, but the concept of software as a service. That changed how you developed software, because all of a sudden you can go from a waterfall model to an iterative model. And that made it such that you can have a dialogue with your users and iterate in the direction of your users. So you don't have to think ahead of time for 3 years of what things will be. You can try something and then move on with this. The second was web and mobile. And that changed to your point, the design and the delivery of how you delivered software. And so you had to start to do more design thinking and also think about many different endpoints. And that's changed things a lot. What now I'm seeing, especially now in the AI group, is more of a data mindset. And that changes the programming methodology and model. You no longer are looking at how do you figure out all the rules ahead of time, but how do you learn and what data do you need? And that adds a whole different element to software development as well.
Thanks. Sanjay?
Well, thank you. So, when I hear about product innovation, it brings me back to the days of Alibaba. That's when I first got my hands into product innovation. Now, most of you probably know Jack doesn't have a tech background, nor do I, and nor does number two, Joe Tai. But a lot of our product innovation was really centered around the question of why. Why are we doing what we're doing? And my experience prior to Alibaba was really working for small trading business. I had some serious challenges in how to compete. When I met Jack in '99, we thought about how do we really empower the SMEs, what tools do we need to give to them, and based on that, we developed the products that are now, Ant Financial, that's worth 150 billion, Taobao. So a lot of the products that really came out of Alibaba was based on solving problems that small enterprises had. Fast forward 15 years, I had the same problem as an individual. Finding the right person was really, really hard, whether in an enterprise of 1,000 people or just in a conference. And I said, what if we could really create a platform that uses artificial intelligence to match people based on skills? And that's what we started to do. We identified the problem and then created a product to solve that problem. And today with Kaildo, we built a AI-based, skill-based technology, matching technology that gets used in enterprise as also in communities.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Bring the startup perspective. KK, your thoughts?
Good. So I end up seeing all the three perspectives because if you see HCL, we have an IT services business where a lot of the product innovation has to be taken as a service to the customer. So hence you are in the middle of offering management. We use this term called offering management, taking products, converting them to offerings to solve solution outcomes for customers. We've got an engineering business where we build products in many cases, and I know two of them here, at least how we are partners with them. We've engaged within different parts of their businesses to do product engineering. So we end up being on the other side, working in that tail of how to innovate at a very, very early stage. And third, we have our own IP-led business, as Howard introduced. It's now hit $1 billion run rate, where we're going through the same product challenges. We've got older products, we've got contemporary products, which need to be modernized, built into microservices, made into as a service, and then you have to build newer capabilities like infused data, algos. So from our perspective, the most important thing, finally, people always think that services companies are built around people. I think product companies equally, as much or even more sometimes, are all finally got to the individuals who build products. And acquiring the right talent, and also ability to take people who build software to understand outcome of software. So one of the things which I've learned over the period of time in the product industry is you build software, ship it, the customer figures it out, and that's where the SI and the service. Now it's no more like that. The customer is expecting, and I agree to Sanjay. I have seen VMware change, correct? We realize as a product, if you see 4 years back to now, massive evolution because the design thinking mindset being brought in because, hey, how will the customer use it, correct? And how will that, same thing with Google, correct? The products around, the same thing with TIPCO, correct? I'm seeing that whole evolution of moving to as a service and you're delivering SaaS, which means that you need to deliver to the end customer consumption model. It's a big challenge. It finally comes back to the individual and the humans and how they really build products in a different way.
Thanks. I think there are a lot of common themes that we see here. Let me take first the strategic ones and then a few of the organizational ones that we have. In the spirit of what KK was also saying, where you started down this path as well, there's a shift, right, to the services side. I mean, we talk about anything as a service essentially nowadays. What really does that mean for your organization? You alluded to it by saying that we had to do things differently. What was it that you had to do differently?
Well, I think Sanjay mentioned too, the whole tradition of enterprise software was very much a kind of waterfall process, and you kind of had to think ahead several releases, and you didn't want to release things too quickly because it was hard for customers to absorb it and implement it and install it. You take away kind of all of that, and you're just offering something as a service, and you can iterate on innovation faster. So your development methodologies change, your marketing to the customer changes, your relationship to the customer changes, and I think this whole notion of customer success and what it means to make a customer successful changes a lot in that kind of environment. And then there's pretty dramatic changes in the way you think about your business model. If you're selling services or selling SaaS versus licenses, it just has a whole range of impacts on what your P&L looks like, how you motivate the sales force, all those sorts of things.
Two important things I heard there. The capabilities have to change and the business model changes as well. Sanjay, Poonan, you also talked about this in the transformation. How do we go about actually changing the capabilities? Because that sounds easy, but it's not. It's a fundamentally different way of thinking about the business, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think, listen, I think that sometimes I described it as twofold. There's an organic and inorganic. So if I just kind of go with that, there are times where the right approach is the current team that you have, infused with potentially some new talent, and usually with leadership. And I think the leader and the leaf level have to agree on the mission, and we've had success with that effort inside VMware. What we've done in the hyper-converged area with our storage product, what we've done in the cloud area with the cloud partners are good examples that I think it had a combination of a leader that we appointed that was kind of a change agent, whether they came from within the company, and then the leaf level. I'm not trying to say the middle management in that structure isn't important, but if you get the engineers and the leader really motivated, the middle structure almost doesn't matter because you can get that team. Well, in other places where we had to really jolt the system because we had perhaps a effort internally that was not going anywhere, we were so far behind potentially in a place, we had to then have some leadership construct that could make the case to our board that an inorganic move was the right thing to do. And that took a bold effort of the executive team and ultimately the board signing up to do something that was transformative in terms of using a balance sheet or whatever have you to buy something. And my sense is that those principles applied even to what I saw at SAP. The moves that we made at SAP that were inorganic, whether it was business objects or later on some of the cloud moves, and they've continued that even after I left, where McDermott felt very much that I'm the CEO there now. And then there were organic efforts like HANA that became enormously successful because you had a change agent like Vishal who was very passionate about that. I think those principles, and you can't have a recipe that's cookie cutter for every company. You have to sort of assess that based on what the core DNA of the company is, the leader is, and where you are in that market. I personally feel for a software company, organic innovation, you want to really have a DNA that's 70, 80% of the time organically innovating. Because if you rely on acquisitions, you'll become like some software company, I don't need to name who they are, that have just acquired, and a lot of their acquisitions have, and listen, quite frankly, I think there's a Harvard Business School, again, I'm not sorry, I shouldn't be, there's a Wharton study too on this too, that showed that most acquisitions fail. I'm sure Wharton's done work on this. And maybe
I agree, that keeps me having a job, so it's a good thing, so.
90% of them fail largely not because the product was a failure, but the people leave, and somehow the process does not get integrated into the parent company. The parent company stifles them out. So I think you want to have a organic first innovation philosophy. Google's really good at doing that. I mean, I think we admire a lot of the innovation. Amazon's also done that fairly well. And if you build that in, then the inorganic part's an easy, nice layer to put on top of that as opposed to the other way around.
No, and I think what resonates with me is, it's not just an easy solution to go for the external sourcing, right? I mean, implementation's difficult, it fails most of the time. The other part is, it requires a different mindset, that you have to be open. The tough part, I think that you were alluding to, is that it's very difficult to also strike the right balance. There's another very well-known company in the hardware space, Telecom Equipment, I forget their name, dominated the market for a long time, known for acquisitions, went too far, then went the other direction. I want to go to Sanjay Varma before I come back to Rajan. Sanjay, if you think about capabilities from your point of view, right? From the point of view of, especially of Alibaba, it was not the case of an established incumbent where you can draw upon resources to buy firms and do these other things, but rather you have to build this up. And it's product innovation, it's business model innovation, all these new capabilities. How do you go about doing something like that? And what is the role of leadership perhaps in that whole?
Well, I think the biggest question really is why, and that's what really attracts the best talent, right? It's not the money, it's not the salary, it's the purpose. And so I remember when I joined Jack, I took a huge salary cut. Actually, everybody did. My wife wasn't too happy at all, but the purpose was there, and that was more important to us. And same thing at Kaildo. I mean, we're a small company. We have 20 people.
Yeah.
And we have some of the best AI talent in South Africa. They're just incredible, and they're committed to what we do. They're committed to the purpose. They believe that we'll be around 20 years later, 30 years later. And that's what is really, really important, is what is the why and how sure are they that we will keep to that focus? That's most important.
So tell me more. I mean, what drew you to now you're your entrepreneur, you're doing these things, but to these iconic leaders, what is it that they do differently, or how do they think differently?
Well, I think, first of all, in terms of, they are very clear on the purpose. They are very clear that they will not move away from the purpose, and that's just non-negotiable. And when you...
So you either buy into it or you don't?
You either buy into it or you don't. And that's what I think really attracts the right talent.
Fascinating.
Actually,
Go ahead,
I just threw in, I heard a great quote on this earlier today, which is, people come to a company for the mission, and they stay for the values.
Yeah. I think that's a great way. And there's a generational shift that we seem to be observing in that. We may as well leverage that mission-driven millennials and generation, whatever X, Y, Z we're on right now. I think I belong to one of them, but not quite. So it's really, but it's very powerful to think of it that way. Rajan, you work for a company that in many ways aspires to be mission-driven, but also deals with a lot of new talent, new capabilities, and you see that. How do you nurture that? How do you find that talent? How do you nurture that talent and get them to stay and produce? Must be hard. I mean, cloud, AI?
Well, and I think it goes to what you're saying about being mission driven, and I think that a lot of people come to Google because of the mission and because of this idea of organizing the world's information, and I think that one of the things that I'm finding, you brought up the kind of the leaf node comment. I think that is an important thing. How do you motivate people to do their best work? And if they feel like they're actually taking the company in a direction that they personally believe in, then that helps a lot. And so we are much more of almost well, we're a company that listens to a lot of different perspectives, and that really helps kind of create a cohesive culture. But it's tough to do that too. I mean, then the larger you grow, the more it's tough to balance that. But it's important to keep those values in the culture.
Interesting. Now, when you operate in an ecosystem, and Sanjay, you had talked about this too, but let me stick to Rajan for a minute. You're not just working with your own people, right? I mean, this is spanning boundaries of different organizations. How do you keep that going then?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that a lot of times it's looking at who are the right partners that also can do that. And so I'll give you an example. When we first started Google Apps, which became G Suite and is essentially Gmail, Google Docs for businesses and education, we struggled with finding the right sets of partners at the time, because there are a lot of partners that didn't have the same kind of mindset that we did. But we were able to latch on to actually a few very small companies at the time that really helped power our business and they did a lot of the things that we didn't do, but they did it well. But they believed in this idea that the cloud and this new kind of iterative business model is going to reshape how we can deliver software, and that helped us actually become successful.
I mean, I think another really example in your old group, Android. I mean, that's all ecosystem.
Yeah, absolutely.
The success of Google Android is the ecosystem. I mean, it's an incredible play that you guys played.
And I think for a platform company like us, we're nothing without the ecosystem. And so you have to seed the ecosystem with the right set of partners and extend that. And that's a great example.
So chime in on this.
Absolutely.
Corroborating 2 points, and I'll give you, like, HCL worked with we are big in consumer electronics, and we helped on an ecosystem with Google and that TV manufacturer to do the first Android TV port, basically. And they're writing their own software, and at some point in time they realized, hey, core television software other than the hardware controls with Android TV coming in, it's a good example. The same thing what we've been working with VMware around the NSX side. That's a completely ecosystem play. And then me and Sanjay were chiming yesterday saying that, hey, how do you drive that more deep? Because software-defined networking, people have this uncrazy expectations that everything will work, and then the underlying port collapses. People blame the SDN layer, not the switch layer. How do you make sure you bring that ecosystem in play? It's going to be very, very critical.
Yeah, what's hard though about these things, you guys make it sound so easy, right? Is that appropriating the value from an ecosystem is sometimes hard, right? And it's very powerful. How do I make sure that I also get the value? Value creation is one piece. Android's a great example. We all, there's a huge pie out there. It was able to challenge the dominance of Apple. But then how do you appropriate that value? Any thoughts from the three of you on that? Maybe Sanjay,
I mean, I think
because you
that
talked about it early.
you have to, again, it sort of starts with leadership. I mean, I think similar to many of the comments made here, in our case, because we're sort of this Switzerland company, from the birth of this company 20 years ago, we'd invented virtualization for an x86 architecture. We existed because the hardware guys either were going to fight us or we partner with them. So if you go back to the early roots of how Diane started the company, she partnered first with IBM and then Dell and HP hardware companies. Now you move that to the cloud. Who are those analogs? It's the Amazon, Azures, and Googles. In the device world, Apple, Google, Microsoft, Windows 10. So we prioritized leadership, a set of strategic tech partners that we spend a lot of time with their leadership teams, with their executive teams, with their product teams. And it's almost like it's survival for us.
Yeah.
If you think about the capital structure of VMware, we're 80% owned by Dell. Okay?
Yeah.
Yet today, our two biggest partners are Dell on one side and the cloud guys, who in fact are trying to say the world is moving the opposite way. And we have to live in that dichotomy at VMware, and that's what's made us successful, is being completely Switzerland. I like being here and talking about Switzerland because we are in Switzerland.
Yeah.
But that's kind of, when you have that as your proposition and you internalize it, then the product teams and the sales teams get it. And software companies, those are the two big engines, an R&D team and a sales team. You want to make sure that they understand that. And for some companies, ecosystems aren't important because they don't need it.
Yeah.
But in our case, it's almost, essential to survival.
So let me ask Sanjay Varma one thing, and then actually, Rajan, were you going to comment?
I just wanted to piggyback on
Yeah.
one thing. I think one thing that's important there is there's a leap of faith that needs to be taken, because there's the temptation to keep moving up the value chain and obviate value for the ecosystem. But like I was there at VMware in those early days where there was a temptation to actually move up that stack, and then I've seen it a lot. But a lot of times you have to kind of leave that for the ecosystem such that the ecosystem flourishes.
Makes sense. One more question on ecosystems for Sanjay Varma, more because, and then I'll turn to Murray with a different question. Sanjay, from an entrepreneur's point of view, what makes for an attractive partner when these big guys want to tap into all your expertise, the inertia-free stuff, and you're doing cool new things? What do you look for in a bigger partner?
At Kaildo,
some surprises for these guys, So yeah.
so at Kaildo, we have visualized our ecosystem fast forward 10 years, 15 years, and sure that's going to change a bit.
Yeah.
And the ecosystem really is a platform where you have enterprises. It's like a conveyor belt sort of analogy. You have enterprises that have Kaildo on the platform, and talent comes in and out, and then you have a horizontal conveyor belt where talent comes in and just moves in from one organization to another. And that's the vision we have. And so what's important is, when we look for partners that really understand this is where the future of work is going to be.
Yeah.
This is how people are going to operate, and really to give people purpose in an organization, to give people purpose who are not in an organization. If that's the winning formula, we try and explain to partners, this is your winning ticket, really. Because if you look at nearly all organizations today, they're worried about competition.
Yeah.
Pace of change is really fast. They're worried about keeping the people. They're worried about hiring the right people, and that trend is just accelerating.
Yeah.
So we basically are the call it the fluid workforce, right?
Yeah.
Where it's liquid workforce. That's what we want to build, and that's what's really appealing to a lot of the enterprises we're talking to.
What I love about this is there's a nice complementarity, right? Oftentimes we have this romanticized notion of startup, established player, one gets rid of the other. And it happens in some instances, but many of these examples, we actually need collaboration between both sides, which is very important. Murray, one question to shift gear a bit for you is, if we think about how we compete, right? Moving and sort of in the spirit of ecosystems, but broader than that, we now look at platforms, right? As a very important way of competing, right? And so I wanted to get more of a philosophical reaction from all of you. Open source or not? Proprietary, open source. What are your views? And I think we'll differ here. What do you think?
So we were a company that had a history in very proprietary architectures.
Yeah.
And we generated a lot of value out of that because the proprietary architecture meant we could optimize the performance of certain systems to the extreme. And in one really good example was trading systems and kind of the messaging infrastructure to get the the lowest possible latency and the performance of those systems. Today, we're actually as interested and as invested in open source as an open source company. We produce our own open source. We embrace a lot of open source technologies. I think the big realization for us, and this is what I think is going to be the new normal for a while, is there is no silver bullet. I think if you're going to base everything on open source, that has its own costs and risks. I think it's pretty clear proprietary only is probably only going to work in a very narrow set of circumstances. So this kind of heterogeneous approach to the technologies and the kind of modes of innovation and software is what is going to deliver the best value. And your ability to move back and forth between various types of, whether it's open source or it's something commercial source, depending on the circumstances and what you need at that point in time.
There are trade-offs, perhaps, or
Trade-offs, and it's fluid.
efficiencies.
It's fluid, and I think you've got to be nimble enough. And one of the things we see again and again with our customers is a very, very big desire to avoid lock-in of any type.
Yeah.
And that's in fact why they kind of got interested in open source in the first place.
Yeah.
I mean, free is nice, but the bigger thing is that it prevents vendor lock-in.
Yeah.
I think we've had a history in enterprise software that's made companies suspicious about vendor lock-in. So if you can enable choice, they like that.
Yeah.
What that means is you've got to continue to innovate at a very rapid pace to keep their attention.
Sanjay?
Yeah, I think, listen, all of us probably have some proprietary DNA to a lot of what we've done. And, I think that we have to balance the purpose of building a business. And there's probably two nuances to open source. First off, I think generally the world is embracing open standards. So if you nuance open source from open standards. So if there's a standard that's being adopted in the industry, the right thing to do is not to fight it, but to adopt it. We have had that as a principle, and I think all the companies here would say that that's kind of something that is, if you try to kind of fight it, you'll get on an island and ultimately get isolated. We've sought to at VMware, and this might sound a little self-serving because there have been competitors that have tried to open source everything we do, and they've been reasonably successful. But in the early days, all the open source efforts to open source a hypervisor failed, and we kind of survived through that. And we fought it because we just built a better product than the open source. So if an open source product is better, you're going to lose that game, and your proprietary stack's going to lose. We had to fight that in the early years. You were there at the time, and the team did a very good job in every open source effort to build a competitor to vSphere failed. But over time, there have been layers on top of that and around it that have become open source reasonably successful. It's probably the most important one we track for the future is Kubernetes in the container world, that Google originated. The founders of Kubernetes started a new company, Heptio, that we acquired a few months ago. That's got some legs to it. Now, when we see that happening at VMware, we can take two approaches to that, which is fight it, and the more appropriate one is embrace it, okay? Which is say, listen, if this thing's happening and you got the weight of people like Google and we've got the founders of Kubernetes now working for us, let's basically embrace it and make that a layer on top of our hypervisor to take the future of virtualization to the container world. And I would argue the two biggest headwinds that have been facing VMware are cloud and containers. And for us, it was a lesson on how you make those headwinds tailwinds by embracing them. If we had not embraced cloud, Amazon, Google, and others, you probably wouldn't be talking about VMware and relevancy today. And I would say for the next 5 years, the other C that we had to embrace was containers. And I think for us, it's been a very important management lesson is if you have a headwind and you can find a way to convert that tailwind, it actually works to your benefit.
What I heard from these two guys is, I prefer proprietary, but if I have to, then I'll do open because that's necessary. So that's how I interpret the hedging, right? So do you agree with that, Rajan, or no?
It's a great question. It's funny because we internally debate this all the time.
Yeah.
And we're an interesting company because we're built on a lot of open source and we release a lot of open source.
Yeah, and you compete that way.
That's true. And building on open source increases the velocity at which you can operate. And you run into the issues of how do you make sure that that's stable and you can keep evolving, but it makes it so that you can move much, much faster if you do that. Releasing open source, there are a variety of reasons. And I think part of it is looking for, you have to look at what is the reason you're open source. And Kubernetes is a great example. The reason we open source Kubernetes was that we believe that one way that we could compete in cloud is to be open. And if we made it such that people could move freely between clouds, that's going to benefit us. And but it's not always that simple. And because there is a tension there. Like a lot of engineers do want to open source what they're doing, and so we try to figure out kind of what's the rationale behind open sourcing, and how can we be as open as we possibly can while looking out for the aims of the product.
I mean, it's a vexed question because of this. The mission-driven side often wants everything open, right? But when you've got the realities of competitive advantage and making money off these things, sometimes it's a challenge. KK, I know you have some thoughts on it, and I think I know where Sanjay Varma stands, but go ahead. So yeah.
So we see a very interesting perspective, again, from our three businesses. Building on open source and open sourcing is one. The most important point which the enterprises whom we deal with most of the time, they miss the part is the TCO.
Yeah.
See, open source, and I think Sanjay's point, he said free software versus open source is one, and proprietary versus it's all about speed. The third thing is it's going to cost you a full stack. So if you take open source like CentOS versus Red Hat Linux, massive debate within customers, correct? Should I go CentOS? Great, but then who's going to run the builds, correct? Who's going to make sure you're patched, you're tested? What's the equivalent of patch delivery? And then when you start to add those costs, you might get away cheap on the software, you might double up spending on services or building your own engineering team. So I think open source, I strongly believe open standards, and HCL is on the board of TOGAF, the Open Group. So we are on the board of Open Group. We are actively working on multiple open standards initiatives, including, by the way, Unix standard is still owned and driven by the Open Group. This thing, IT for IT. We are actively involved in Cloud Foundry Foundation. Pretty interestingly, we're seeing another good area. A lot of companies have adopted it, like Pivotal. Google has contributed a lot towards that whole piece. SAP, everyone is building around the Cloud Foundry Foundation. Same thing with CNCF. So we're seeing that adopting an open standard and then building around this is a far better way. Doesn't mean open source is not the right way to go. It's again, you have to make a call of what do you want to build. Is portability important? Do you want to control the full stack? And please look at the TCO, because do not try to jump in just by looking at a piece of the whole thing and then figuring out, hey, I missed this whole 3-4 different things behind it.
And KK, that makes sense, but also the point is that what my customer wants is very important to me, right? Yes. So that's the other piece that I hear. I think I know where you stand, but tell us,
Well, for us, it's all about delivering the right value to the customer.
Yeah.
And we raised $5 million at seed round, and we just ended up building our own stack.
Yeah.
Because we couldn't find open source, so it was just good enough. But going forward, if we could go find open source that could deliver the same value or better value at speed, we'd do it for sure. It's all about really empowering the customer.
Yeah.
That's the way we take it.
And that's a nice way to think about it. I want to shift gear a little bit. We've been talking a lot about products. We've been talking about markets. We've been talking about competition. There's a layer out there which is sometimes beyond our control, or we might be able to influence, which is the regulatory environment, the policy framework in which we operate. Rajan, I want to start with you with the AI side because it just strikes us immediately, and then get others' thoughts on it. What do you think? I mean, what has to happen? Where do you see the future changes that have to take place in that regulatory framework in order to enable more of these technologies to see the light of day and for us to know how to operate?
Yeah, and I think it's a very interesting question because I think what's happening right now is that the pace of change of technology is way outpacing the policy. And so many of the policies, especially around technology, were designed for technology that was there 20 years ago or more. And so shifting that is important because that needs to keep up. I think that what we need to do is figure out how we can work closely with policymakers to educate them about the changes that are happening and what might be coming ahead. And then, but then the policy process also needs to be more agile. And we need to start to think about that kind of more in concert with each other. But it's a very tough thing. I mean, we encountered this with cloud.
Yeah.
The concept of cloud was very much in a different direction from where policy was. And now with AI, it's in a very similar situation.
So concretely, what change would you like to see in either of those policies?
I think that with cloud, we need to really look at kind of what is the purpose of a particular policy? What's the intent? And rather than kind of jumping to the implementation, what is the intent? And can that be implemented in a different way? And then with AI, I think what's there is that AI opens up many, 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 many more possibilities. And policy is really important there. One thing that we've been putting forth is our AI principles and talking about kind of what are the things that we should be thinking about how AI should be used in the world. But that needs to be something that is jointly done by many companies and policymakers at the same time. And it is opening up a whole new world that if done right now can actually lead to really great change.
If I just add two things to that as it relates to AI, I think there's going to be some really interesting dilemmas that we're going to have to face that will require government policy as AI. I mean, I'll give you one. We were discussing this actually in one of the sessions that Google was in earlier on AI. Should a driverless car, when it's making a decision at a very critical juncture, take the life of the driver or the pedestrian?
Yeah.
I mean, there was a book written on this that you wrote about, and those are interesting choices where there's going to be ultimately, I think, I mean, that's just one example, but I think that AI is never going to be able to give you the emotion, the ethical, if you want to go further, the religious aspects of what a system should do, or show love to, so all of those sort of soft side of our brain, I mean, it's programmed to do the same thing predictably and again and again and again, and a human being will make a choice to say, well, I did this 9 times, but this time I'm going to show a little more love to my kid. That's not a machine.
Yeah.
So I think all of that, I think there's both policy and ethics and the things that make us so different as a human species from a robot. And on the policy pieces of it, I think there's going to have to be some way in which a body, and I'm just using the government as an example, legislatively controls some of that, because in the absence of that, I think you could have some scenarios that are not good for society.
Murray, anything to add to that?
Well, I mean, Davos here, there's a lot discussed on the ethics of AI, and I think there is clearly a new onus on technology companies in particular who haven't really had to deal with this until now to sort of step up and try and take the initiative on defining some of these policies or principles themselves, because the machinery of government will probably never catch up.
Yeah.
I think it's probably unlikely that
Always
policymakers will ever catch up. So it's incumbent on us to try and take the leadership. The other thing, though, that I find is a little more anecdotal, but I find it fascinating, is I find myself arguing with my 15-year-old about the value of algorithms over human-driven policy. And he says it would be so much better if algorithms were deciding these issues. So I find that fascinating, because that's a generational mind shift or mindset shift.
Yeah, it reminds me of some of the early things as well. Any quick points on that, KK? or
Just 2
Sanjay
points.
Varma?
I'll have Sanjay the last one.
Yeah,
because
yeah.
He's in the AI and skill and human, correct?
Exactly.
So 2 things. I think product development in the AI space, which is very IQ oriented, you have to infest the EQ, the emotional quotient, into the whole this thing, and start to bring that aspect, which is where I think we have to, and Sanjay pointed that on this thing, that a lot of these things got to do with the EQ factor. The second is that we have to find a way for politicians to at least be, I've heard some of the YouTube debates and hearings, and I'm worried because the policy makers are not educated enough. Or we have to find a way collectively as an industry to either participate or this thing, or get them up to a common minimum level. Like we're talking about UBI for this thing. We have to have some UBI equivalent for this policy makers. At least they have some common level of understanding to take even decisions. Or not try to do a referendum and try to get people to decide, but you have to find a more logical way to handle that. That's what my view is.
Sanjay Varma, yeah.
So, it's interesting. Here I am, a startup, talking alongside guys who are running billion-dollar enterprises. I agree with the panel. I think technology will always be ahead of policy. The way we've approached it is that we've always tried to figure out what's a win-win for the company and the user. And I'll give you a case in point. When we started up Kaildo, we said what's really, really important is for our users to have complete control of the data. Right? That was fundamental. And when GDPR came along, we had no issues whatsoever. And so as long as we are, we keep ourselves honest, and we think about the consumer all the time, and there's a good balance, I think we'll be okay. That's, we don't have the privilege of actually working with policymakers. One day we will, but that's how we take it.
That's a nice way to put it. All right, before we open up for some Q&A from our audience here as well, one question I'd like each of you to answer in 30 seconds or less. We're talking about the future of product innovation. So I wanted to ask each of you, what's one thing that you need to do differently, either as a person or as an organization, to be ready for the future of innovation? Right?
Well, I think diversity and inclusion, I guess, are going to be absolutely vital to the future of innovation.
Yeah, I'd say two things. One is be always comfortable, and as you progress up the hierarchy, to learning. Don't forget that. And secondly, be very open to input of people who critique what you're doing.
So that means that you're not open right now? If it's one thing that you have to change?
I think, listen, it's easy especially as you go up, to kind of get hardened in your own view.
Yeah.
And people might be intimidated of giving you feedback because they work for you.
Yeah.
And you have to build mechanisms where people feel very comfortable critiquing.
It's a great.
Because a good part of how you're innovating is something you may not be doing today.
Yeah.
And I think that the great leaders are always, I think Jeff Bezos calls it a day one mentality. Just every day is like you just started the company today. As opposed to, well, we're so established and we're so big and nobody could disrupt us. And you look at great companies. I don't mean to put this company down, but this is an American icon, GE. It's worth less than VMware today. Who would have thought that the great company that was worth 400 or 500 billion is worth 60 billion market cap? So, this could happen to anybody. And you live a little bit in that fear. Sorry, I took more.
No, that's okay. Yeah, you were aware of it. Yeah. This is why you invoke some. Yeah, Rajan?
I think the point about diversity and inclusion is really important, especially as more of a data mindset comes into place.
Yeah.
You need to make sure that the right data is coming to the system from diverse viewpoints. I think another one is continuous learning, that these technologies are changing so quickly that whatever we all learned in college or wherever we learned it is going to be irrelevant very soon, or already has been. And so we're going to have to continue to adapt to what's new.
Sanjay?
Yeah, I agree. I think continuous learning, being adaptive is going to be critical. The pace of change is only going to get faster every day. And if we're not equipped for that, if our kids are not equipped for that, then I think we're heading for problems.
So be ready for the pace, so you have to be even faster. KK?
Our CEO keeps telling this, correct? Learn, unlearn, relearn, correct? It's not, you also have to learn to unlearn, correct? And that's important. The other important thing is, day one is important, EQ. Bring the EQ along with the IQ in the whole pace.
That's advice. Do you have EQ?
I'm sometimes more EQ balanced.
No, having that. Very good. All right. Let's get some questions from you. I know that there's some rovers with the mics as well. So please ask our panelists. They've given us a lot to think about. We hope that it sparked some thoughts in you as well. Questions?
Hi, thanks for a great discussion. I'm Amit Varma, part of HCL. My question was on platform. I was having a discussion with many people, and a lot of questions on platform, like is it products or platform, or how do you have to rebalance? There's a very famous book, Machine, Crowd, Platform, and they keep saying, you have to rebalance between mind, machine, and crowd and core, and products and platform. So when you look at future of product innovation, where do you see that coming in, and what impact that will have on the product innovation?
Platforms. Who wants to take that one on?
I'd say briefly, most software companies build tools. Okay, and we see sort of this progression of tools, platforms, apps. A good example of a tool, maybe in the early days, Excel. It's a tool. It's a really good tool. You build a platform when you have an established set of ecosystem that build on top of you. .NET became that. Google's a platform. So, and it's really very easy to measure the number of ISVs or partners that are built on top of your platform. And to do that, you need things like APIs. The vast majority of software companies never go from a tool to a platform. And then, of course, on top of platform, you get the option to build apps. So that's how we think about it. There's a significant amount a greater monetization from a platform than from a tool.
So you're saying you need to go to a platform, though?
Yeah, if you want to build long-term value, you got to move from a tool to a platform.
So I'd give maybe just one other interpretation of what it means to be a platform,
Good
and
point.
that's Lego. I actually think of Lego as a kind of platform because there's a generic set of components, but you can, as the user of Lego, build all sorts of solutions. Lego can build solutions. You know, the X-Wing fighter set still uses those same fundamental components, but build something very unique out of it. And I think that's a little more the way we like to think of platform. I think the ecosystem point is important, but I think this next generation of platforms is about how you give the consumer of the platform the most flexibility possible. And that's also where I think, you know, open source versus proprietary. Let the consumer use the right service or tool for the right job.
Just one point.
Sure.
Differentiate technology platforms and business platforms. And I think that's going to be the key thing is what is a tech platform which is powering or standard horizontal, which is then powering a business platform. And I think when more and more companies try to differentiate, then they will say, because a lot today what's happening is every company wants to build platforms.
Yeah.
And they're trying to build a bottom-down stack. I think when they start to differentiate what's platform which I need to really build versus what I need to really consume. And I think it needs that mindset.
One thing I'll say though is that I don't think people, when you're starting out, people won't buy a platform. They either buy tools or they buy applications. And so you got to start there, and then you have to evolve into a platform. And I think a lot of times, you know, we've started out in places where we built a platform and realized that, you know, we have to do something different. You either have to make developers more productive or make business people more productive.
Makes sense. Very powerful. Questions? Other questions?
So thanks, great conversation, Shwaikat, Professor Shwaikat. I think I heard in the earlier part of the product innovation conversation 4 things. You know, one was proprietary. We all love proprietary when we can make money there. Then we go to open source, open standard, and KK brought in TCO. Look at the four and the correlation between the 4. Generally, anything which has evolved in the open source space became a product which was acquired because you had to monetize, right? Look at what happened with various versions of Linux, right? So in future, do you see it is more open standards versus open source? Because anything which evolves from open source ultimately will get monetized someday. Walk the proprietary cycle, come back to open standards, and then start the journey all over again. So is it like we have a cycle of life in the product innovation space, or do you see that as a discontinuity?
I actually see it as more open source than open standards. And part of the reason for that is that with open source, you can actually move more quickly and create a standard with this. And so one of the things I think that is there with open standards is that it's great when you do have a standard, but it takes a lot of collaboration to get there. And what you also see, though, with open source is a lot of times people will put something out there, and that becomes a standard.
I just say briefly, this is a very intriguing topic, and it's almost very relevant right now if you've been following the raging debate between MongoDB and AWS and a couple of other players as to, in open source, I think the entire model is being disrupted some by the cloud. So if I was an open source company and the cloud company could take the exact same open source code, offer it on their platform for free and make money on the other resources, compute, storage, networking, and the open source part saying, that's completely legal, okay? So it's like a company that's great at medicine, but a much bigger company is able to offer that medicine for free because they've got so many other medicines that they have in their cabinet. And it's a tough one to reckon with. I think that the spirit of open source is that if you're not contributing back to the community, I think you get frowned upon. But I think that the revenue models of these companies, I mean, I'll probably go on the record as saying, I don't know that there'll be another open source company that exits for $34 billion, which was the price that Red Hat got from IBM.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone will get to that because it's really hard to build a open source company that will get to that size of revenue in this new cloud world. It's going to be very difficult because all the cloud vendors have embraced open source and are monetizing it in different other ways.
Great points. Some really good points. I mean, the tension between the making money versus the other. Yeah. Go ahead.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that?
Sure.
We are all talking very inside the IT industry, and you know, somewhere we think we are the coolest thing on the planet. But look at a contextual example and look at, I would say, earlier avatar of what happened faster in the industry, telecom, right? telecom, if you look at the disruption in telecom in the last 15 years or so, OSI and all that, look at mobile networks, the way they evolved mobile standards, and look at the price of telecom, per call or per minute or per data point today. It's taken the innovation in a different trajectory exponentially and cost in an exponential downward trajectory. But in IT, the TCO equation has not been solved. You go to a customer, and it's always the question is that you guys keep innovating, but my cost keeps really practically going up because you had so much complexity. Maybe that's the secret sauce in our industry. But look at the contextual telecom example. They've done something very dramatically different. The penetration, the cost, and the innovation are on 3 different curves, delivering a great value to the end customer and consumer.
So you're not a panelist, so I'm not sure if I can disagree with you, actually. I think part of the issue here is every company is becoming a technology company. And that's why the TCO for IT appears to be expanding. But they're all doing so much more than they were a decade ago. I mean, when I look at the level of sophistication in digital presence and digital strategies with companies across a whole variety of industries, they're looking more and more like technology companies in and of themselves. So that, I think, complicates measuring what's really going on with the cost dynamics. I mean, they're creating digital experiences for customers that are vastly superior to anything they offered customers 10 years ago. So I think tech companies will have more of a run for their money in some of these areas as customers eat into some of that.
So, Professor, I think probably that's a thing Wharton could do because IT industry is not going to answer that question.
The question that I would have asked, and I was kind of holding back on, is what's the one thing that will disrupt each of you? What gives you the sleepless nights? Because, it's sort of like, yes, we do these things and I get it, but what's the one thing that will disrupt you?
Well, I'll just say one thing I find a little ironic, being at Davos and hearing all the talk about AI being so disruptive to labor, which I see the point, I'm not disputing that, but as someone who runs a tech company, my number one concern about disruption is access to skilled labor.
Yeah.
So just getting enough of the right kinds of skilled people is an enormous challenge. And if that labor pool is constrained or dries up for some reason, that's a problem.
And if they don't come to you,
I'd say it's two. It's the 2 I mentioned. Listen, if the entire world moves to the cloud and one cloud, I don't think you need a VMware. If the entire world on premise moves from virtualization to containers, you probably don't need VMware unless we. So both of those are significant threats. And then you had a question, how do you protect yourself? And those are at least 2 that we spend a lot of time thinking about.
I think for us, probably every roughly 5 to 7 years, something completely earth-shatteringly new comes about and disrupts all of us. And so, first it was cloud and the concept of web services. Then it was mobile, and that we had to do a lot to adapt to that. Then it was AI, and so I think the thing that I worry about is what is that next thing, and we probably have no idea what it's going to be.
Embrace uncertainty. Yeah.
So at Kaildo, we believe that we're sitting on a multi-billion-dollar opportunity, building a new operating system for people. And so I guess what keeps me awake at night is just our speed of execution. Once people realize what we're doing, what we worry about is that they'll catch up. That's one. And 2, less of a worry, but it's when a big player changes their business model. And that's really quite hard for big organizations to do, right? When they're really comfortable making the money, whether they're ad-based or transaction-based, they will not change. But that's still, that concerns me a bit, because I saw that's exactly what Jack did with eBay in China. eBay had 85% market share, and Jack started Taobao and went for free 2 years. eBay was out.
Change the rules of the game.
Completely.
So, yeah.
Completely.
KK?
Skills, relevant skills, continuous learning of skills, inertia. My biggest worry is that from our perspective, people talent, second, if you don't do anything or if you're stuck in a zone, that's the biggest worry. So you have to keep moving, because for us, if you don't move, we'll be just left behind. So I think
Yeah, one of the reasons I asked this question is because it's actually hard for us to conceptualize what is it that will disrupt us, right? So that's not the right answer in some sense, instead of tracking it. We just have to figure out how to respond to things quickly and nimbly. When it does happen, that's why you need these approaches. Question over here.
I've got a very short question for Sanjay Varma. In a world where we move towards algorithms leading product innovation in the future, and you have one single bet, would you bet on getting better data or getting a smarter algorithm?
Great question. I don't know if that's only for Sanjay, right? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I would bet on getting more data, right? And I think if you look at China, I mean, China's really taking off because they've beaten the US in terms of data. And I think with the data, they can create more products and more solutions. And with that brings in more data, and they just create this huge momentum. So I would bet on better data. I think the incremental improvements in algorithms is quite small, but data is where the game plays.
Come on, disagree with them.
Come on,
I actually
exactly.
would slightly disagree.
Yeah.
I think that data is a longer-term differentiation. I do think, though, that algorithm innovation and the pace of algorithm innovation is changing quite dramatically. And staying on top of that gives you an advantage. And so we've seen, for example, that I've seen the pace of going from things that are in pure research to real product has shortened down to maybe 6 months to a year in many of the things that we're doing. And so us being able to stay on top of it is actually giving us a big edge.
I like that distinction between short and long term, by the way. I think that's a very important piece here. Another question?
Yeah, hi. My name is Abhinav. I work for HCL for a corporate venturing team. So what I wanted to know was we do induce a lot of open innovation in product management, as in like we work with startups and trying to introduce into them into the ecosystem. What I wanted to know, what's the impact? I mean, is what's the view of the panelists that are they doing it, and what's the impact on the product innovation, and how does it impact?
And open innovation can be very broad. Everything from crowdsourcing to, in your case, investing in startups and corporate venture style model. What's your experience? We talked earlier a bit about external sourcing, but more about ecosystem and partnerships as well as M&A, but there's another piece to it.
I think it's extremely important. And one example that we saw, we released this technology called AutoML last year, which is essentially it's machine learning that creates machine learning. And you give it a set of data, and it'll actually pick an algorithm for you to that matches that data high quality. The things that we found people doing with it were just mind-blowing, things that we could never do. So for example, one company was using it in agriculture to figure out the size of a potato harvest. Another company was using it to actually spot different hinges and make it easy to replace hinges. Things like that is innovation we would never, ever get to, and we needed in a large ecosystem out there to be able to do that. So I'm a firm believer in igniting that long tail.
So I guess we talked about organic growth. It's not always about acquisitions. It's all about creating that ecosystem and finding out ways to collaborate and work with them. All right. Thank you.
Any other questions? Let me take the opportunity then to summarize a few things from our panel, because I think it's really quite powerful, all the things that we've learned. So I've learned a lot from you guys. I mean, one thing is, for instance, that the power of mission and how we can leverage that, even in areas or industries where we think it's more, we have a very product orientation and, we think about solving problems, but very much in a B2B or B2C context. I think the power of mission works also in attracting the right talent. Second thing that I really learned, which is very important, is that business models are changing in the era of product innovation, right? And what that means is the capabilities that I need can fundamentally shift. Now, the third point is where I can source those new capabilities can be organically, but also inorganically, and no one strategy suffices. So it's not enough to say, oh, I'm just doing organic, or on the inorganic side, only acquisitions, but this combination of ecosystems, maybe even investments, all of that actually works as well. what I like and what gives me a lot of hope is rather than this antagonistic view between startups and the established players, there was some level of friendliness here as well. So it's really important to think about, all right, how do we collaborate, leverage the best of these both worlds, whether internally or with the other partners, to build the ecosystems that can be successful. Fifth point I gathered here is it's about trade-offs. We have limited resources. We have to be able to put things in particular places and get the things done and remain competitive. How do we do that in the most efficient way? And the final thing I picked up is disrupt yourself, otherwise somebody else will do it. That's hard because you have no idea what's going to disrupt you. So you have to keep on experimenting, keep on learning, keep on taking risks, and be very, very agile. Thanks very much. KK, do you have anything to say at this juncture? And thanks.
No, I think I'll finally hand it back to Howard for him to conclude, because he started this and give his vote of thanks.
Oh, okay. We always want to surprise you. We always want to surprise you. You know, so
I guess I still have the mic, so I still have it here. No, thank you, everyone. I actually did have a last question, but I think maybe I'll spare everyone since it's been a long one. But I really enjoyed it. I hope everyone else did here as well. And if people are able to stick around a little bit, it would be great for folks to meet some of the panelists. Thank you again.
Thank you very much to our panelists
Thank you.
and to our audience.